They said there was no policy. The insurance company had been trying to reach me for 3 years. I want to start with that sentence, because for 3 years following my husband's sudden death, I believed a specific, confidently delivered claim made by my own stepchildren, a claim that convinced me I had no financial safety net beyond my own modest savings. Savings I subsequently drained almost entirely, covering funeral costs and settling outstanding debts I believed, at the time, were simply mine alone to manage. I want to tell you exactly how I eventually learned this claim was never true, because I think if you've ever trusted grieving family members simply because questioning their explanation felt like an unbearable addition to an already unbearable loss, you already understand the particular, quiet devastation of discovering exactly how much that trust actually cost you. Hello and welcome. This is a quiet place for stories about the moments people finally uncover exactly what was quietly withheld from them, often during the most vulnerable, difficult periods of their entire lives. If any part of this story feels close to your own experience, I hope you'll stay until the end. My name is Vanessa. I am 52 years old. And 3 years ago, shortly after my husband Thomas passed away suddenly from a heart attack, his 2 adult children from his first marriage told me there was no life insurance policy in place, a claim I believed entirely, until a routine letter from an insurance company recently revealed that I had, in fact, been the sole named beneficiary of a $200,000 policy the entire time. I want to tell you about my marriage to Thomas first, because I think understanding our specific relationship and my relationship with his adult children matters enormously for everything that eventually happened. Thomas and I married 8 years ago, both of us entering our second marriages after previous divorces, meeting through a mutual friend's dinner party when I was 41 and he was 49. I want to be honest that our relationship developed slowly, carefully, both of us genuinely cautious given our previous experiences with marriage, but ultimately building into something I genuinely believed represented the most stable, loving partnership of my entire adult life. I remember the specific dinner party where we first met. A mutual friend's modest apartment gathering where Thomas and I ended up seated beside each other, almost by accident, discovering, over the course of that single evening, a genuine, easy compatibility neither of us had quite expected to find again after our respective divorces. I remember him walking me to my car afterward, both of us lingering considerably longer than the conversation strictly required. And I remember the specific, quiet certainty I felt driving home that night, understanding, somehow, that I had just met someone who would come to matter enormously in my life. We married 2 years later, a modest, intimate ceremony reflecting both of our shared preference for simplicity over spectacle. And I remember Thomas telling me, during our vows, that he considered our marriage a genuine second chance neither of us had fully expected to receive. A sentiment that captured, I think, the particular gratitude and care with which we both approached building our shared life together. I want to tell you about Thomas's 2 adult children from his first marriage, Julia and Mark, because understanding my specific relationship with them throughout our marriage matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded following Thomas's death. Julia, Thomas's older child, was 26 when Thomas and I married, already established in her own career as a marketing executive, living approximately 3 hours away in a different city. Mark, 2 years younger, was 24 at the time, still finding his professional footing, working in various sales positions while living considerably closer, in the same city where Thomas and I eventually settled together. I want to be honest about the specific texture of my relationship with both of Thomas's children throughout our marriage, because I think understanding this genuine complexity matters for everything that eventually happened following Thomas's death. Neither Julia nor Mark ever treated me with outright hostility during our 8 years of marriage, but I also want to be honest that neither of them ever fully, warmly welcomed me into their own understanding of their family either. Our interactions remained consistently polite, occasionally even genuinely warm during specific holidays or family celebrations, but always carrying a particular, underlying reserve that I understood, throughout most of our marriage, as simply the natural, reasonable caution adult children sometimes maintain toward a parent's second spouse, regardless of how genuinely that spouse might treat their parent. I remember specific holidays throughout our marriage where this particular reserve manifested in small, unremarkable ways. Julia addressing cards to Dad rather than Dad and Vanessa. Mark occasionally referring to family memories from before our marriage in ways that, while never intentionally excluding, simply reflected a family history I hadn't been part of building. I never held these small moments against either of them, understanding them as ordinary, reasonable evidence of a family adjusting to a new configuration, rather than any deliberate unkindness, and I made a consistent, genuine effort throughout our marriage to build my own separate, warm relationships with both of them, an effort I believed, for most of our 8 years together, had gradually succeeded in building genuine, if measured, affection between us. I want to tell you about Thomas's sudden death because understanding the specific circumstances of his passing and the immediate aftermath matters enormously for everything that eventually happened regarding this insurance policy. Thomas passed away 3 years ago, a sudden, massive heart attack that took him within hours, offering none of the extended warning or preparation that some families are fortunate enough to receive before losing a loved one. I remember that specific day with a clarity that still catches me off guard sometimes. An ordinary Tuesday morning that transformed, within a matter of hours, into the single most devastating day of my entire adult life. I remember Thomas complaining that morning of what he described as mild indigestion, an ordinary complaint I encouraged him to simply monitor rather than treating with any particular urgency, both of us going about our usual morning routines without any specific sense that anything was seriously wrong. I remember receiving the call from a coworker approximately 2 hours later, informing me he had collapsed at his office, and I remember the specific, disorienting blur of the following hours, the drive to the hospital, the particular quality of a doctor's careful, gentle expression before delivering news no spouse is ever fully prepared to receive, regardless of how many television dramas might have attempted to prepare us for such a moment in advance. I want to walk you through the immediate weeks following Thomas's death, because understanding exactly how the estate's logistics came to be handled primarily by Julia and Mark rather than by myself matters enormously for understanding how the eventual deception regarding this insurance policy was able to occur. In the immediate, disorienting weeks following Thomas's death, I found myself genuinely, profoundly unable to manage the countless practical logistics that a sudden death requires: funeral arrangements, notification of various institutions, the beginning of what would become a considerably complicated estate settlement process, Julia drawing on her own professional experience managing complex projects, and Mark, given his closer physical proximity, both stepped in during this period, taking primary responsibility for managing these logistics, an arrangement I genuinely, gratefully welcomed at the time. Understanding my own limited capacity to handle these practical matters while navigating such acute, overwhelming grief. I remember specific moments from those early weeks where I simply couldn't bring myself to make even the most basic decisions, staring blankly at forms requiring my signature, unable to focus long enough to read even a single paragraph of legal language, grateful in those exact moments that Julia and Mark seemed willing and capable of managing what felt, to me, like an entirely overwhelming avalanche of practical requirements. I remember thanking them both repeatedly during this period, genuinely believing their involvement represented a specific, meaningful kindness during a time when I had nothing left to offer toward managing my own late husband's affairs. I want to tell you about the specific conversation where Julia and Mark first told me there was no life insurance policy. because understanding the exact framing they used matters enormously for everything that eventually unfolded. Approximately 3 weeks after Thomas's funeral, Julia and Mark sat down with me at my own kitchen table, explaining, with what struck me at the time as genuine, careful compassion, that they had spent considerable time reviewing their father's financial records, and that they had unfortunately discovered no active life insurance policy among his various accounts and documents. They explained that Thomas had apparently let an older policy lapse years earlier, during a difficult financial period following his first divorce, and had never gotten around to reinstating it, an oversight they described with what felt like genuine sympathy, as unfortunately common among people who assume they have more time to address such administrative matters than life ultimately allows. I remember Julia specifically saying, during that conversation, "We wish we had better news, Vanessa. We really do. Dad always meant well, but he wasn't always great about staying on top of paperwork like this." I remember Mark nodding along beside her, adding something about how their father had mentioned, years earlier, meaning to look into updating his coverage after their parents' divorce, but apparently never following through. I remember believing every word of this exchange completely. The specific textured detail of their explanation, the shared corroborating nods between them, all of it reading, to me, as exactly the kind of genuine, difficult family conversation it appeared to be, rather than anything requiring further scrutiny. I want to describe my reaction to learning this information, because I think understanding my genuine, grief-clouded acceptance of this claim matters for understanding exactly how significant the later discovery eventually became. I remember sitting at that kitchen table, absorbing this news alongside the countless other devastating pieces of information I was already navigating during those raw early weeks. And I want to be honest that I felt, at the time, simply another layer of loss added to an already overwhelming grief, rather than any specific suspicion or doubt regarding what Julia and Mark were telling me. I remember the specific quality of that afternoon, gray light coming through my kitchen window, a cup of tea going cold in front of me that I never got around to drinking, Julia and Mark sitting across the table with expressions of careful, practiced sympathy that felt, at the time, entirely genuine. I remember nodding along, my mind still fogged with grief thick enough that processing any single additional piece of difficult news felt like simply one more wave in an ocean I was already struggling to stay afloat in. I want to tell you about the specific financial burden this belief created for me over the following months, because understanding the genuine, significant cost of trusting this claim matters enormously for understanding exactly what this eventual discovery would come to mean. Thomas's funeral, a modest but genuinely meaningful service reflecting his own specific wishes, cost approximately $18,000, a figure I covered almost entirely from my own personal savings, understanding, based on what Julia and Mark had told me, that no insurance proceeds existed to help offset this expense. Beyond the funeral itself, Thomas had accumulated some modest medical debt during a previous, unrelated health scare 2 years before his death, debt that I took primary responsibility for settling, again believing I had no additional financial resources beyond my own personal savings and Thomas's relatively modest retirement accounts to draw upon. I remember the specific, methodical way I approached settling these various expenses, treating each bill and each payment plan with the same careful, disciplined attention I brought to my own professional work managing hospital budgets, understanding, at the time, that I needed to be genuinely responsible given what I believed were my own limited resources going forward. I remember a specific evening, roughly 6 months after Thomas's death, sitting at my kitchen table with a legal pad, calculating exactly how many additional months it would take to fully rebuild my depleted savings, a calculation that filled me, at the time, with a quiet, resigned determination, rather than any particular resentment, since I genuinely believed I was simply managing the ordinary, unfortunate reality of my late husband's financial affairs. I remember the specific, careful budgeting I undertook during those months, cancelling a planned vacation, postponing needed repairs to my own car, working extra hours at my job as a hospital administrator, all in service of rebuilding the savings I had drained so completely covering costs I genuinely believed, at the time, fell entirely on my own shoulders. I remember feeling, throughout this period, a specific, quiet pride in managing this financial hardship independently, understanding it, in some strange way, as my own final act of devotion toward Thomas, handling his affairs responsibly, even in the absence of any insurance safety net. I want to tell you about the following 3 years, because during this period, I simply continued believing this explanation entirely, gradually rebuilding my own financial stability through careful, disciplined saving, understanding my own resources as genuinely limited to whatever I could personally earn and save going forward. I remember specifically how this belief shaped countless smaller decisions throughout those 3 years, choosing a more modest apartment when my lease renewal came up rather than the slightly larger space I might have otherwise considered, delaying a long-planned trip to visit my own sister overseas, consistently prioritizing rebuilding my depleted emergency fund over almost any discretionary spending, all based on an understanding of my own financial situation that I now know was entirely, unnecessarily constrained by information Julia had deliberately withheld from me. I want to describe the specific circumstances that eventually led to this claim's true accuracy finally being questioned, because this discovery emerged once again, almost entirely by accident, during a period when I had no particular reason to be investigating Thomas's old financial records at all. Approximately 2 months ago, I received a formal letter from a life insurance company I didn't immediately recognize, addressed specifically to me, referencing a policy number and requesting that I contact their claims department regarding what the letter described as beneficiary verification for an unclaimed benefit. I remember the specific afternoon this letter arrived, sorting through an otherwise unremarkable stack of mail at my kitchen counter, mostly bills and advertising circulars, this particular envelope catching my attention simply because of its formal, official-looking letterhead rather than any immediate sense of its actual significance. I remember turning it over in my hands several times before opening it, some small, half-formed instinct telling me this envelope carried more weight than its unassuming appearance initially suggested. I want to describe my initial reaction to receiving this letter, because I think understanding my genuine immediate skepticism matters for understanding exactly why I nearly discarded this letter entirely before eventually deciding to investigate it further. I remember holding this letter, genuinely uncertain whether it represented some kind of scam or marketing solicitation rather than any legitimate correspondence, given how thoroughly I had believed, for 3 full years, that no insurance policy connected to Thomas existed at all. I remember setting the letter aside on my kitchen counter for several days, genuinely undecided about whether it warranted any further attention, before finally deciding, out of simple practical caution, rather than any genuine expectation of significant discovery, to call the number listed and verify its legitimacy. I want to tell you about that phone call, because it represents the actual beginning of everything I eventually discovered. I called the number listed on the letter, expecting, honestly, to quickly confirm this was either an error or an attempted scam before moving on with my day. Instead, I found myself speaking with a genuinely helpful claims representative named Mr. Delgado, who confirmed, after verifying my identity, that I was indeed the sole named beneficiary of a group life insurance policy Thomas had maintained through his employer, a policy valued at exactly $200,000. I remember the specific, careful patience in Mr. Delgado's voice as he walked me through the verification process, understanding, I think, from years of experience handling similarly sensitive calls, that whatever he was about to reveal likely carried considerable emotional weight for the person on the other end of the line. I remember gripping the edge of my kitchen counter as he confirmed the policy's existence. Some instinctive physical need to steady myself against information that felt, in that specific moment, almost too significant to fully absorb standing upright. I want to describe the specific moment I first learned this information because it represents a genuine, disorienting recalibration of everything I had believed about my husband's financial affairs for the previous 3 years. I remember sitting in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, feeling a specific, physical sensation of the floor genuinely shifting beneath me, as Mr. Delgado calmly, professionally explained details that directly, completely contradicted everything Julia and Mark had told me during that difficult conversation 3 years earlier. I asked him, my voice not quite steady, how long this policy had existed, and he explained, checking his records, that Thomas had enrolled in this specific group policy through his employer's benefits program nearly 12 years earlier, several years before we had even married, and had maintained continuous, active coverage throughout the remainder of his life, right up until his death. I want to tell you about the specific question I asked Mr. Delgado next because his answer revealed something considerably more troubling than simple, innocent confusion regarding this policy's existence. I asked him, directly, whether anyone else had previously contacted the company regarding this specific policy, understanding, even as I asked, that I needed to know whether Julia or Mark had perhaps genuinely, innocently overlooked this policy's existence, or whether something considerably more deliberate had actually occurred. I remember the specific pause on the line while Mr. Delgado checked his records, a brief but genuinely agonizing silence during which I found myself holding my breath, some part of me already, instinctively bracing for whatever answer was about to arrive. I remember him returning to the call with a slightly more careful, measured tone than he'd used previously, the particular shift in a professional's voice that signals they're about to share something they understand carries genuine emotional weight for the person listening. I want to tell you what Mr. Delgado's records revealed, because this information fundamentally transformed my understanding of everything that had happened over the preceding 3 years. He explained, after checking the company's internal records more thoroughly, that someone identifying themselves as Thomas's daughter had, in fact, contacted the company approximately 4 months after Thomas's death, inquiring specifically about the policy's status and the claims process required to access its benefits. He explained that this caller had been informed, during that specific call, of the exact beneficiary designation, my own name, and had been provided detailed information regarding the documentation required to initiate a formal claim. I want to describe my reaction to learning this specific detail because it represents the actual moment I understood this situation extended considerably beyond simple oversight or innocent confusion. I sat in my kitchen, phone still pressed to my ear, feeling a specific, slow-building horror as I understood that Julia, who I now strongly suspected was this specific caller given her role in handling Thomas's estate affairs, had apparently learned, directly and explicitly, that I was the policy's sole beneficiary. Information she had then, for reasons I couldn't yet fully understand, chosen not to share with me, instead allowing me to believe, for the following 3 years, that no such policy existed at all. I want to tell you about the specific steps I took following this initial phone call, because understanding exactly how I approached investigating this discovery further matters for the eventual resolution of this entire story. I asked Mr. Delgado whether the company maintained any recorded documentation of this specific call, understanding, given the significant implications this discovery carried, that I would need considerably more concrete evidence than simply his verbal account before I felt confident proceeding with any direct confrontation. I want to tell you what this additional documentation eventually revealed, because the details, once I finally obtained them properly, painted an even more troubling picture than the initial phone call alone had suggested. Mr. Delgado explained that the company maintained detailed call logs, including the specific date, duration, and general summary of customer service interactions, and he offered to formally request this documentation be released to me, given my own legitimate standing as the policy's actual named beneficiary. Several days later, I received a formal summary of this call log, confirming that a caller identifying herself as Julia Whitmore, providing Thomas's policy information and her own relationship as his daughter, had contacted the company on a specific date, approximately 4 months after Thomas's death, receiving detailed information regarding the policy's active status, its full value, and my own name as the sole named beneficiary. I remember opening the email containing this formal summary, my hands genuinely trembling as I scrolled through the document, reading Julia's full name printed clearly in the caller identification field, alongside a time-stamped summary describing exactly what information she had been provided during that specific call. I remember reading the document 3 separate times, each pass through its careful, clinical language landing with fresh, renewed weight, understanding that I was looking at unambiguous, professionally documented proof of exactly what had happened, rather than simply my own suspicion or second-hand account. I want to describe my reaction to receiving this formal documentation, because I think understanding the specific, complicated emotional territory this discovery required me to navigate matters enormously for understanding everything that happened next. I sat with this documentation for several days before deciding how to proceed, understanding that I was facing considerably more than a simple, isolated oversight. Julia had apparently known, with complete, explicit certainty, that this policy existed, and that I was its sole beneficiary, information she had then chosen deliberately to withhold from me for the following 3 years, a choice that had cost me considerable financial hardship during a period when I was already navigating profound, acute grief. I remember reading that call log summary at my own kitchen table, the same table where Julia and Mark had originally told me no policy existed, feeling a specific, quiet fury build slowly beneath my initial shock. Understanding that every difficult financial sacrifice I had made over the preceding 3 years, the cancelled vacation, the postponed car repairs, the countless extra hours at work, had all been genuinely unnecessary, had all resulted directly from a lie I had trusted completely, simply because I couldn't imagine Julia capable of something this deliberate. I want to tell you about the specific decision I eventually made regarding how to approach this situation, because I think the deliberate, careful path I chose matters considerably for understanding how this story eventually resolved. I decided to consult with an attorney before initiating any direct conversation with Julia or Mark, understanding that whatever emotional reckoning I eventually needed to have with this discovery, I wanted to first fully understand my own legal standing and options given the specific circumstances involved. I remember the specific week between receiving that call log summary and my first meeting with Miss Patterson, a strange, suspended period during which I continued my ordinary daily routine, going to work, managing household errands, all while carrying this enormous, unresolved discovery privately, understanding that I needed to approach whatever came next with considerably more care and preparation than my raw initial anger alone might have allowed for. I want to tell you about this consultation because the attorney's explanation clarified several important details I hadn't previously understood regarding my own rights in this specific situation. The attorney, a careful, experienced woman named Miss Patterson who specialized in estate and insurance matters, explained that because I was the policy's explicitly named beneficiary, Julia and Mark had never actually had any legal authority or standing to interfere with or delay my access to these benefits, regardless of whatever role they had taken in managing other aspects of Thomas's broader estate. She explained that insurance proceeds designated to a specific named beneficiary typically bypass the general estate entirely, meaning that even if Julia and Mark had been managing other estate matters, this particular policy had never actually been theirs to manage or withhold information about in any legitimate capacity. I remember sitting across from Miss Patterson in her small, well-organized office, watching her explain this specific legal distinction with a patient, methodical clarity that I found genuinely steadying amid everything else I was processing. She walked me through several similar cases she had handled over her career,
families where a named beneficiary had been denied timely access to benefits due to other family members' interference, explaining that while such interference was, unfortunately, not entirely uncommon, it rarely reflected any legitimate legal complexity and almost always resulted from exactly the kind of interpersonal dynamic I was describing to her: resentment, financial anxiety, or a mistaken sense of entitlement regarding funds that had never actually belonged to anyone but the named beneficiary. I want to describe learning this specific legal detail because it clarified something I hadn't previously understood about exactly how deliberate and unnecessary Julia's withholding of this information had actually been. I understood upon learning this detail that Julia hadn't simply failed to inform me about a policy she had some legitimate reason to manage or control. She had specifically, deliberately withheld information about a benefit that had never had anything to do with her own role in managing Thomas's estate, information that legally, unambiguously belonged to me from the very moment of Thomas's death. I want to tell you about the specific conversation I eventually had with Julia and Mark, because it represents, I think, the actual climax of this entire story. I contacted both of them, requesting a joint meeting, explaining only that I had recently learned some important information regarding their father's estate that I needed to discuss with both of them directly, deliberately not revealing, in advance, the full extent of what I had already discovered.
I want to describe that meeting carefully, because the specific way it unfolded matters considerably for understanding the genuine complexity of what I eventually learned about their actual motivations. We met at my own kitchen table, the same table where they had originally told me no policy existed 3 years earlier, a detail I chose deliberately, understanding that returning to this specific location carried a particular meaningful weight, given everything that had happened there previously. I remember preparing for that meeting with unusual care, printing multiple copies of the call log documentation, organizing my thoughts carefully with Ms. Patterson's guidance beforehand, understanding that I wanted this conversation to unfold calmly and factually, rather than dissolving into the kind of raw, unproductive emotional confrontation that might have felt satisfying in the moment, but that I understood, from everything this experience had already taught me, would likely accomplish considerably less than a measured, documented approach. I did not raise my voice through any part of this conversation. I had learned, through everything this particular discovery had taught me, that the truth, properly documented and calmly presented, rarely needs volume to be genuinely effective. I began by asking them both, directly but calmly, to describe again exactly what they had discovered regarding their father's insurance situation, giving them a full, genuine opportunity to offer their own account before I presented what I had already learned. I want to describe their initial reactions, because understanding the specific difference between Julia's and Mark's responses matters considerably for the full resolution of this entire story. Mark, I want to be honest, appeared genuinely confused by my question, repeating the same explanation about the lapse policy that I had believed for the previous 3 years. An explanation I now understood, with considerable certainty, he likely genuinely believed himself, having apparently never been directly involved in whatever specific conversation Julia had eventually had with the insurance company. Julia's reaction, by contrast, carried an immediate, visible tension that told me, even before I presented any specific evidence, that she understood exactly what I was about to reveal. I want to describe the specific moment Julia's composure began to unravel, because it represents the actual turning point of this entire confrontation. I placed the formal call log documentation on the table, explaining calmly that this record confirmed a call made from her own name 4 months after Thomas's death, during which she had been explicitly informed of the policy's active status, its full value, and my own name as its sole beneficiary. I want to tell you what Julia eventually admitted, because her explanation, once she finally offered it, revealed a motivation considerably more complicated and considerably more troubling than I had initially anticipated. She told me, after a long, difficult silence, that she had in fact discovered this policy while reviewing her father's employment benefits documentation and that she had specifically called to verify its details, understanding immediately that the benefits belonged entirely to me. She explained that in the weeks following this discovery, she had struggled with a specific uncomfortable resentment, understanding that I would receive a significant financial benefit from her father's death, while she and Mark, his own biological children, would not directly share in these particular proceeds. A resentment she described, with visible shame, as having ultimately led her to make the specific, deliberate choice to simply tell me and Mark that no policy existed at all. I remember Julia describing the specific weeks following her discovery, explaining that she had initially told herself she simply needed more time to think through her feelings before saying anything to me, a delay that gradually stretched from days into weeks, and eventually, she admitted, into a specific, deliberate decision to construct an entirely different explanation, rather than ever actually revisiting an honest conversation about what she'd found. She told me that once she and Mark had jointly delivered this false explanation to me that first time, she felt increasingly trapped by her own initial choice, understanding that correcting the record months or years later would require admitting not just to the original discovery, but to the ongoing deliberate deception she had maintained ever since. I remember watching Julia's hands twist together on the table as she spoke, her voice considerably smaller and less composed than the confident professional demeanor I had known throughout our 8 years of family gatherings, and I remember feeling, even amid my own genuine anger, a strange, unexpected recognition of how deeply this specific choice had apparently weighed on her over the preceding 3 years, whatever her original justification had been. I want to tell you why Julia specifically chose this deception, rather than simply having an honest, if potentially uncomfortable, conversation about her own complicated feelings regarding the policy's distribution, because her answer revealed something genuinely difficult about her own understanding of fairness following her father's death. She told me, with considerable difficulty, that she had convinced herself, in the weeks following her discovery, that since Thomas hadn't specifically updated his beneficiary designation following our marriage, this likely simply represented an oversight on his part, rather than any deliberate, considered wish, and that she had rationalized her decision to withhold this information as somehow correcting what she'd convinced herself was probably an unintentional administrative error, rather than her father's genuine, considered intention. I want to be honest with you about my reaction to this explanation, because I think it matters for understanding the genuinely complicated resolution this entire story eventually reached. I told Julia, calmly but directly, that her father had actually updated this specific policy's beneficiary designation twice during our marriage. Information Mr. Delgado had confirmed during my own conversations with the insurance company, once shortly after our wedding, and again 3 years later following a minor administrative update to his employer's benefits program. Evidence that Thomas had, in fact, deliberately, repeatedly, confirmed his considered wish that I remain the policy's sole beneficiary throughout our entire marriage, rather than this representing any kind of accidental oversight Julia had convinced herself justified her own subsequent deception. I want to describe Julia's reaction to learning this specific detail because it represents, I think, the moment her own rationalization finally, fully collapsed. She sat with this information for a long moment, visibly absorbing the fact that her father had not simply forgotten to update an old designation, but had actively, deliberately confirmed his considered wish on 2 separate occasions, evidence that entirely contradicted the specific justification she had built for herself over the preceding 3 years. I remember watching something shift, visibly, in Julia's expression during this specific moment, the last remaining thread of her original rationalization finally, fully giving way. I remember her saying, quietly, almost to herself rather than directly to me, "I think I knew that somewhere. I think I just didn't want to actually know it."
It was, I think, the single most honest sentence she offered throughout our entire conversation. A brief, unguarded acknowledgement that whatever story she had told herself over the preceding 3 years had always required a specific, deliberate effort not to examine too closely. I remember the particular quiet that settled over that kitchen table in the aftermath of this revelation. Mark staring at his sister with an expression somewhere between disbelief and genuine hurt. Julia herself, finally, visibly deflating from whatever careful composure she had maintained through most of our conversation up to that exact point. I want to tell you about the specific resolution we eventually reached, because I think it represents a genuinely thoughtful, if imperfect, path toward addressing what had happened. I told Julia and Mark, directly, that I intended to formally claim these benefits, understanding this represented my father's own explicitly documented, repeatedly confirmed wish, rather than any oversight requiring correction. I also told Julia specifically that while I understood the complicated grief and financial anxiety that may have contributed to her original decision, the specific choice to deceive me for 3 full years, rather than simply having an honest, if difficult, conversation about her own feelings, had caused genuine, unnecessary hardship during a period when I was already navigating profound loss. I want to tell you about Mark's reaction throughout this entire conversation, because I think his genuine surprise and discomfort regarding his sister's actions provided an important, validating confirmation that I hadn't been entirely alone in finding this situation genuinely troubling. Mark told me, clearly upset with his sister, that he had genuinely believed for 3 years that no policy existed and that learning Julia had specifically known otherwise, while allowing him to continue believing this false explanation as well, represented its own separate significant breach of trust within their own sibling relationship, entirely apart from whatever harm had been caused to me directly. I remember Mark turning to Julia directly during this portion of our conversation, his voice carrying genuine hurt rather than simply the calm, documented approach I had maintained throughout, asking her how she could have let him repeat this same false explanation to me, to other family members, to their own extended relatives who had occasionally asked about Thomas's estate over the preceding years, all while knowing definitively that the explanation was entirely untrue. I remember Julia struggling to answer this specific question directly, her composure finally, fully breaking as she admitted that she had genuinely not considered at the time how thoroughly her decision would eventually implicate Mark in a deception he had never knowingly participated in himself. I want to be honest with you about how I feel now, several weeks removed from that difficult conversation at my own kitchen table. I do not feel simple, uncomplicated triumph, the way you might expect from a story that resolves this dramatically through documented proof of deception. I feel instead something considerably more complicated. Genuine relief at finally understanding my own husband's actual, deliberate wishes regarding my financial security following his death, alongside real, ongoing sadness that someone I had spent 8 years attempting to build a genuine, if imperfect, relationship with, had chosen deception over honesty during one of the most vulnerable periods of my entire life. My relationship with Julia remains genuinely strained since that conversation, considerably more distant than even the reserved, careful warmth we had maintained throughout most of our years as family. We have spoken twice since. Brief, careful exchanges that carry none of the easy comfort of our earlier interactions, and I want to be honest that I don't yet know whether we'll ever rebuild anything resembling genuine closeness, understanding that some breaches of trust require considerably more time and consistent effort to repair than others. My relationship with Mark, by contrast, has actually grown somewhat closer in the aftermath of this discovery. Both of us bonded, in an unexpected way, by our shared experience of having been deceived by someone we each trusted completely. He has reached out several times since our original confrontation, checking in on how I'm doing, occasionally sharing his own ongoing difficult conversations with Julia as their own sibling relationship works through the specific damage this situation caused between them.
I have since formally claimed the insurance benefits, a process Miss Patterson helped guide me through carefully, and I want to tell you that receiving this payment felt considerably less like triumphant vindication and more like simply, finally, receiving what my husband had always deliberately intended for me to have. I used a portion of these funds to finally take the extended time away from work I had genuinely needed since Thomas's death. 3 years of continuous, exhausting labor without any real break, finally giving way to a proper period of rest and reflection I hadn't previously felt I could afford. I remember, during this time away, visiting Thomas's grave more intentionally than I had managed during the preceding years of financial strain and constant work, sitting there quietly, telling him, out loud, that I finally understood exactly how thoroughly he had tried to protect me, even from beyond his own unexpected death. I also used a portion of these funds to finally make that long-delayed trip to visit my own sister overseas, a reunion I had postponed for 3 consecutive years, believing each time that I simply couldn't justify the expense given what I understood as my own limited financial resources. I remember standing in her kitchen on that visit, both of us older than the last time we'd properly seen each other in person, and feeling a specific, quiet grief for the years of connection this false financial constraint had cost us, time we could never fully reclaim regardless of how thoroughly the underlying deception was eventually corrected. If there is one thing I want you to take from this story, it is this. Grief creates a particular kind of vulnerability that people are sometimes willing to exploit. Understanding that a grieving person often lacks the emotional or practical capacity to scrutinize claims that, under ordinary circumstances, might have warranted more careful verification. I trusted Julia and Mark's explanation entirely, not because it was particularly convincing on its own merits, but because I was simply too exhausted by grief to imagine questioning it. Here is a second truth I have carried with me since that conversation. Legitimate financial documentation exists precisely for moments like this, and every named beneficiary deserves to independently verify their own standing regarding any policy connected to a deceased spouse, rather than relying entirely on second-hand family reports, however genuinely trustworthy those family members might otherwise seem. I have since learned, through Miss Patterson, that unclaimed insurance benefits represent a considerably larger problem than most people realize, with billions of dollars in legitimate documented benefits going unclaimed nationally, often because grieving spouses, like myself, simply trust whatever second-hand information reaches them during an already overwhelming period. Here is a third truth. Resentment, left unaddressed and unspoken, can eventually justify choices a person would never have considered reasonable if they'd examined those choices honestly from the very beginning. Julia's decision didn't emerge from simple, calculated cruelty, but from a specific, unaddressed resentment that gradually convinced her that deception represented a reasonable correction rather than the genuine harm it actually caused. Here is a fourth truth. Quiet vindication does not require aggressive confrontation to feel genuinely complete. I did not pursue any additional legal action against Julia beyond formally claiming what was already, legally, entirely mine. I chose instead to focus on the practical resolution I genuinely needed, understanding that this focus mattered considerably more to me than pursuing whatever additional consequences a more aggressive approach might have eventually secured. Here is a fifth truth, one I didn't fully understand until sitting quietly at Thomas's grave months later. Sometimes the deepest comfort a discovery like this can offer isn't the financial resolution itself, but the specific, renewed understanding of exactly how much someone loved and planned for you. Evidence that outlasted their own death by years, waiting patiently for the right circumstances to finally, fully reveal it. And here is the last truth I want to leave you with. Sometimes the people who cause us the deepest, most unexpected harm during our most vulnerable moments are not strangers or clearly identifiable villains, but people we had every reasonable expectation of being able to trust completely. Recognizing this doesn't mean abandoning trust entirely going forward, but it does mean understanding that even our most vulnerable moments deserve some measure of independent verification, regardless of how uncomfortable that verification might feel to pursue. That is my story. 3 years of believing a confident, false explanation, one routine insurance letter I nearly discarded entirely, and one detailed call log that finally revealed exactly what had actually happened to a benefit my husband had deliberately, repeatedly, intended for me alone. I think sometimes about that specific dinner party where Thomas and I first met, both of us cautiously hopeful, neither of us fully certain we were ready to trust again after our respective divorces. I don't regret the 8 years we built together, even now, even knowing everything that eventually happened following his death. I think it's possible to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that our marriage was genuinely deeply loving, and that the family he left behind still managed, years after his death, to cause me genuine, unnecessary harm through a choice that had nothing to do with the actual love we shared together. I visit Thomas's grave regularly now, considerably more often than I managed during those 3 exhausting years of financial strain and constant work. I bring him small updates, tell him about the specific ways I've finally been able to rest, to travel a little, to simply breathe more easily than I had allowed myself to during those difficult years I believed, mistakenly, that I was navigating entirely alone. I like to think, whatever exists beyond this life, that he finally knows I understand exactly how thoroughly he tried to protect me, even from circumstances he could never have anticipated needing to protect me from. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you that grief makes us vulnerable in ways we don't always recognize until much later, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in your own words about a time you discovered something significant had been withheld from you during a period when you were simply too overwhelmed to question it. If this helped you tonight, a simple like lets me know these stories are genuinely worth continuing to tell. Thank you for spending this time with me. I will see you in the next story.